Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to our retrospective of Penumbra. We're playing Amnesia, Dark Descent in the background here, but that's mostly to compare and contrast at the same time while we're going along with our review here. So we're going to start by talking about some of the very basic things about Penumbra, and we'll get a little bit more into some of the nitty-gritty things that I think are important in horror games. But we're going to talk about the aesthetic and sort of the design and the sound first. So obviously, it's not fair to say that Penumbra is a worse-looking game than Amnesia, but it is. It's an older game, and the age of it really shows. It was a lower-budget game, and that really also shows. So the visual elements that are in Penumbra are definitely weaker in terms of the sheer fidelity of it, as well as the experience of the people who made it really shows through better in Amnesia. Like, they've got these dark, gloomy corridors, and you can look at the lighting here and the sort of that contrast. Places that sort of make you feel safe, and I mean, there are these places that are very dark and foreboding, and they've got these sort of visceral, blood-like cues. I mean, that sort of stuff actually wasn't really evident in Penumbra. Penumbra was very white, it was very clean, it was very clinical, or it was very grungy. And like, grungy is not necessarily all that scary in the same capacity that like the castle is in this game. In Amnesia, you're actually in fairly clean buildings, and I think that is because you know, they're relatively well kept. It's just that it makes it contrast more when you do actually encounter like areas that are just flooded with blood or whatever, or flooded in general. And those sort of elements sort of work together a little bit better. Now, if you are going to do a clinical style setting, it is pretty traditional to make it look grungy or dirty. I'm pretty sure that's been around since like Silent Hill, where you be in like the hospital or whatever. But to a certain extent, it just isn't quite as scary a setting, just because it's well lit. Things look quite jolly and vibrant. It looks like the sort of place that you would go to if it's sort of dirty, but you know, it's not really somewhere scary, whereas this castle is like absolutely terrifying. And I think that sort of aesthetic choice, the way they actually pulled it off, though, it worked pretty well. I mean, there's a definite sort of cliche to an abandoned hospital and stuff like that, and that's very much the vibe that you got out of the setting in Penumbra. I don't think that the look of it necessarily was as dark or atmospheric feeling as it was in Amnesia, not either of them. And I think that sort of doesn't really detract from the experience, but it really makes them feel as though it's a step backwards, which it is because they made it before they made Amnesia. So, you know, that's fair. So as for the design and the graphics and stuff like that, I mean, they're part of their time. Like, it looks okay for a horror game made when it was made. It's not necessarily great, but it's also not really terrible either. It's just that if you are used to playing games like Amnesia, and you've played a lot of Amnesia custom stories, those games all look a lot better. They look a lot more atmospheric, they look a lot darker, they look a lot better suited for horror as a genre, I think, than the levels in Penumbra did. Moving on from there to sound, like the sound in Penumbra, and it's okay. I actually didn't mind the voice acting, neither for Maurice nor for the Doctor. Well, to be honest, the Doctor sounded a little bit amateurish. She didn't sound like a professional voice actress, but that's fine. I don't necessarily need her to sound like a complete professional, which is... I think that, for example, Daniel, his voice actor, is much better. As is that weird head you find Agrippa later. On the other hand, I did think that Clarence, I keep calling him something else, but I keep calling him Maurice. But Clarence, his voice actor was actually really good. He sounded that raspy, grady, annoying thing that he is. He sounded like a parasite. He sounded the way I would imagine a parasite would sound, honestly. Annoying and kind of whiny and pathetic. And I think that he portrayed that very, very effectively. So that element, at least as far as sound goes, was extremely well done. On the other hand, I didn't really notice the atmospheric sounds or the music all that much, which is a bit of a shame. Like, if you're playing Amnesia, you'll get those weird, like, scratching sounds in your head, and the way that they contrast, like, sound and silence and the sort of whispering and stuff like that is much better done. It's noticeable, but it's not obtrusive. And I think that that's sort of sort of balance that you want to hit when you're doing a horror game. In Penumbra, I didn't notice the sound at all. It was just basically absent as far as my rubric of attention was going. And I think it might have something to do with the fact that I was so busy being annoyed by that, like, weird discordant music. Like, they have got music when you're being chased by stuff, but it's not very scary music. It's just sort of the very... you're being chased music, which is not what you necessarily want to be going for in horror. You want that idea of tension to be coming from the actual chase itself, not from that sort of not very scary music. There was, I think, music in this game and in A Machine for Pigs when you're being chased, but I mean, it definitely sounded more atmospheric than the music in this, which I just don't find frightening at all. Penumbra, which I don't find frightening at all. So the voice acting, not a lot of it, but what there was of it was either passable. I thought the Doctor was passable, or really good. I thought Maurice was actually excellent. So that's sort of the way that is. And now that I've got the sort of very basic game, sort of element down, let's talk about the gameplay, because this is one of the big sticking points for me for this game. The gameplay in Penumbra superficially looks a lot like the gameplay in Amnesia: A Dark Descent, or more A Dark Descent than it does Amnesia: Machine for Pigs. It is mostly about solving puzzles and using your resources, which are light and puzzle pieces, essentially. Now, in Penumbra, your light source is entirely irrelevant. If I were to go into this sort of extremely dark area here, if I were to crouch, everything in here would be lit up. It would be perfectly bright. I'd be able to see, like in this, I can sort of see this wall here that's near me, and if I creep around here, I can see these boulders. But if I was playing Penumbra, I could see all the way across the room in the dark just by crouching and standing still. It would turn on that weird Batman vision that you get, and you'd be able to just see everything. At the same time, they also have a limited light source, which is very strange to me. It feels to me as though if they were going to... It feels to me that if they were going to make it so that you don't need a light source, the light source that you did have should be purely, like, just... The battery should have lasted the entire game. You shouldn't need to recharge it. You shouldn't need to collect batteries. They felt very superfluous because you didn't need them. You could get everything just by crouching. So mechanically it is just a little bit odd. I mean, it doesn't detract necessarily from the game. You can just think of it as not requiring the flashlight at all. But at the same time, it's just one of those little things that I want to nag about, because it feels very strange when it's like that. And I don't think that they should have included the Batman vision at all. I actually think they should have removed that from the game and made the batteries more important and the flares more important. I think that would have been the better choice as far as all that goes. But, they did what they did. They should have just removed the flashlight requirement from the game. And basically they did. They just made it so that you can run around crouching. The other thing is that the puzzles are a little bit different than they are in Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, and A Dark Descent. In both A Machine for Pigs and A Dark Descent, the puzzles are relatively guided. Like, usually they have much better cues that explain what a puzzle is going to be, how you're going to do them, and they have much better leads and cues that show you how to solve something. In Penumbra, it didn't often feel obvious what you were supposed to be doing in any given puzzle, and it often didn't even make it obvious where to start. And I think that that's a bit of a flaw in puzzle design. It made it a little bit too trial and error. And when a lot of the puzzles that were really frustrating had to be solved while you're being attacked by something, that really makes it frustrating to do, because you have to restart the entire thing over and over again. It really cuts down your ability to do trial and error. So I definitely feel as though that is going to be one of my biggest complaints of this, is the way that they structure the puzzles. The other complaint I have about the puzzles is that they're not consistent. The biggest example I can think of right off the top of my head is that when you're doing, for example, that one where you had to trap that guy in the room and make it so that he was stuck behind the door, that wasn't at all obvious because they had demonstrated before that they just break doors. That there's no reason for me to think that that is going to be different for that particular door. You can't hide behind doors. If you go to the other room and close that door, it's not at all obvious that that's how you're supposed to deal with it. And so the fact that you're able to shut that door with him inside of it, it isn't obvious. It's not clear in a way that I think that it is profoundly detrimental to the way that that puzzle is solved. And similarly, like later on in the game, when you get into some of the other puzzles, they give you no real cue as to how they should be approached. And I think that a good puzzle in a game like this should be showing you either the tools and then you have to search for the way to use them, or you have to search for the pieces, but then it should be relatively obvious how to use them. I think that having people getting stuck on puzzles for as long as you do for some of them, where you're hunting for that stupid switch and how to use it in a context that doesn't make any sense necessarily, I don't think that's very necessarily good puzzle design, especially when you have to wait another 2 minutes before you can go and do it again. Another example is that stupid room where I had to run away from those guys down the corridor, close the door behind me, and then jam it with a cabinet. They had never once demonstrated that that was something that could be done, and there are lots of situations where I could have been doing that. It's just that in that one particular room you can. That's just very poor puzzle design. They need to be more consistent, or they need to give you a clue or a lead up as to how to approach those sort of puzzles or problems. And they don't. That's just the way that they do things. So they definitely needed to sort that out and make that a little bit more clear and obvious as how they were going to be doing those. I think the way that this was going was it was one of those very amateur projects. They were newer at designing horror games. They didn't know as much about what they were doing, and they learned from this, which is good, by the way. Making mistakes and learning from them is a good thing. But I think what they were doing was they had an idea, like, this is a brilliant idea. We're going to have this really interesting chase scene where the player locks him in this cabinet. But they hadn't thought about that until they got to that point, that section that they were going to do it in. This is the feeling I get. So what they ended up with was something that was inconsistent with the rest of the game, where they were breaking through doors. So why would the player think that this door would be any different? Why would they think that trapping this guy in a room was how you're supposed to solve this? I mean, especially because it was that one door out of like 4 doors that you could use to block him. Why was that door the one that could block him? I mean, I guess it had a fancy button or something. That might be justification to make it obvious, but I don't think that was justification at all in that particular context. Especially because like they had burned straight through a steel reinforced door earlier in the munitions room. Does not feel to me as though that other door was any more sturdy than that one in the munitions room. So they definitely did not seem to have that consistency. They jumped around with what the rules were as far as puzzle solving goes. And when you're trying to solve a puzzle, trying to get in the head of the designer is a lot of what you end up having to do, as much as I dislike having to do that. When the designer is changing his mind about how his own world works, it becomes almost impossible to guess what the designer is thinking, and that was one of the main problems that was happening in Penumbra. Trying to figure out exactly what the designer wanted from you was just a real pain. So the puzzles in the game were not necessarily all that fun, and that leads us to the next sort of game mechanic, and that is, hiding from monsters, running and hiding from monsters. One of the things that they did differently in this game is that the monsters were a little bit more apparent. Okay, so the Penumbra monsters were a little bit more just sort of out there than they were in Amnesia, and getting past them was just an issue of stealth, and it felt a lot more like a stealth game, like a Metal Gear Solid game or something like that, as opposed to really anything scary, because they were just sort of like naked dudes walking around with like flashlights and stuff like that. And I mean, yeah, they looked a little bit alien, but they didn't look very scary or anything like that. They wouldn't have been much different if they were armed guards, in my opinion. I had this problem with Outlast as well. I think the issue is that they didn't look like something that I couldn't just beat up myself. If I had picked up like a crowbar or something like that along the way, I probably would have been able to like cudgel one of them to death. And I think that whenever you introduce an element of like monsters that you can do that to, and they're sort of slow, shambling moving, you can easily outrun them. They don't seem to be very coordinated or anything like that. I think that that's a major flaw in the horror that you've got set up there, just because, like for example, in Outlast, the monsters, air quotes, are all just prison inmates. There isn't anything special about them other than they're psychotic. I mean, you could still beat them up. You could still kill them. They do that to each other, it seems, all the time. And I think the fact that you can't, like they've just arbitrarily decided that you're never going to do anything to defend yourself, is extremely silly in that context. In this game, I mean, the shadow, the invisible monster, for example, in the water, a lot of the monsters in this one feel a lot more unmanageable in a certain sense, even if they maybe aren't, because you never see any real evidence that they can be hurt until you find one that had been ripped apart by one of the other monsters. And by then, you're not facing that one. You're facing another monster that's even more scary. In Penumbra, that's never the case. They always look like just naked guys wandering back and forth with hatchets and stuff like that. And because of that, the mechanic of sneaking past them was extremely overused. If you have a monster and you know that's not all that scary, and admittedly the monster in Amnesia is not that scary either, you want to make sure that you're not making it just sort of out there. Like, if it's just a patrolling guard, and it's not a very scary patrolling guard, then you really aren't doing yourself a very good favor. Now, the one monster that actually was well done was the one in the kennel. I still have no idea what that was. I still think that one was actually quite scary. I like it had these weird but consistent rules that it followed. There was foreshadowing as to what those rules were. It was a little bit weird that I couldn't use the flashlight to get past it, but I mean, like, that monster was better than anything else as far as monsters goes in the Amnesia series, except for the water monster. Like, it wasn't even supposed to be, as far as I can tell, invisible. It was just darting out of the hole so fast and just ripping you apart immediately. I think that... Oops, crap, what the hell? Yeah, I think that monster was actually one of the best ones that they've done in the series. Which makes the other ones, like, such a shame. This, by the way, is bullshit. It's like, it's not breakable by hand. Bullshit. But anyway. Yeah, I mean, the monsters in horror games are rarely what makes them scary. And because of that, you know, when they did have the good monster in it, that really added to it, I think. Maurice, on the other hand, you know, not scary at all. He's your buddy. He's a jerk, but he's your buddy. Alright. Now, if I recall correctly, let's open up this. Let's go ahead and grab this. And let's go ahead and hide in here. There we go. I think I'm supposed to hide in here. I can't remember. But, yeah, anyway, like, the monsters ultimately just, you know, were too out there. They were just patrolling the halls. They were being jerks. They were just turning it into a stealth game rather than a horror game. And I absolutely think that was a mistake. I think that they definitely either should have... well, given that... I don't think they could have, with what they had, made the monster any more scary than it was. But they should have done a lot more to hide it and make it sort of follow consistent rules, and they should have made it, you know, frightening and foreshadow it and talk about it a lot. And they did that right with the monster in the kennels, but they didn't do that right with the generic infected guys. Like, the generic infected guys were nothing like that, and it really sort of made them just annoying. It didn't make them scary, it made them annoying. And your monster should never incite annoyance in players in a horror game. Why is this invincible? Oh, wait, that's already broken. Right, okay. But, yeah, so I think that is a real shame, because it's clear that they knew how to make an absolutely terrifying monster. But they also made one that was just an annoying patrol guard, I think, as a gameplay mechanic. So, you know, there was a mixed bag there, and unfortunately the majority of them were duds. So that all aside, let's now talk about the story. And the story is a little bit peculiar in this case because I didn't really pay too much attention to it. I went back and looked over it again, but as I was playing it, I wasn't paying a lot of attention because they kept alluding to things that I thought would come up again and again and again. Like, they talked about red, and then they talked about red, and then they talked about red, and then they never talked about him again. Like, I think that he was probably the saboteur, but, like, they never really gave me much about that beyond that. They never really fleshed out that story or followed through. And same thing with why you're there. They never really followed through much about your father. They never followed through much about anything, really. They sort of had these half-finished plots, basically, I feel. And I think that that's sort of like a shame. You know, they definitely could have done a slightly better job with that. Now, where they did go right, and this is something that has to be talked about whenever you play any horror game or talk about any horror game. What they did exceptionally right was the way they dealt with the motivation for staying in there. Now, horror games, you always have to ask yourself, why the hell is this asshole staying in this place? In Daniel's case, like, he has amnesia. He doesn't remember what's going on, as per the title. So he's wandering around here, like, wondering what's going on. How do I get out of here? So he's actually trying to leave, which is, you know, legitimately a good response to why the situation is. The fact that he can't, yeah, that's fine. Like, I can understand that as motivation and consequence and all that other stuff. That works for that. In A Machine for Pigs, the motivation was he wanted to find his children. He wanted to save his children. That's a legitimate motivation. That's a good reason to be in a place. In Penumbra, they actually get this pretty right. The reason that you're in there was you were looking for your father. That's a good reason to go there in the first place. You thought it was going to be, you know, just a trip to find him there. You didn't think that was going to be what it was. And once you did get there, you got infected by a horrible virus. And once you got infected by the horrible virus, you needed the people in the installation to cure you. So your reason for being there and trying to find the doctor, trying to find her cure, was actually a pretty good reason to stick around in that horrible place. Because, I mean, you could try to leave, but you've got Maurice with you, and he's a complete asshole. And you want to get rid of him. So, you know, just leaving isn't going to accomplish that. You're going to have to find some other way of doing things. And so I think that the motivation for him is really good. And this is a big sticking point for me. Like, Outlast really bothered me in that context, because why the hell was that guy still there? Like, he saw the impaled police officer. I would have got back in my car and driven away. Like, there is no amount of money that the news reporter people could have actually given me at that point in time to continue forward without, like, an assault rifle. Maybe if I had a couple assault rifles and, like, 50 buddies with me, I would have been able to do that. But as it was, just continuing was so stupid. Like, why was he doing that? And, like, the follow-up guy, similar question. Like, there was no good reason for them to have been there. And so that was something that was very, very well done in Penumbra. I thought that element to the story was actually quite good. The other parts, like the Turngate virus, in horror, there's always supposed to be an element of mystery, and as they explain more and more, things become less and less scary. So it is very vital when you're doing horror that you keep some things unexplained in one way or another. And the problem is you have to pick and choose what does or does not get explained. I think that to a very strong degree, you want to make sure that you're explaining everything that isn't supernatural. I don't think they necessarily did a great job of that with Penumbra. I don't necessarily feel as though the parts that needed explaining were well explained. And I don't feel... I feel like they did explain a little bit too much about what the Turngate virus was, which, you know, greatly diminished how frightening it was. Like, at the end, it was fully explained, but what happened to your father isn't really all that well explained. Like, yeah, he gets killed, I think, but, I mean, you know, what other elements is going on with, for example, the other scientists, or what happened to Red in the end, other than, well, he kills himself, but I mean... Besides that, you know, there's a lot of elements that I feel could have been elaborated on. A lot of the characters could have been better elaborated on. Other than Maurice, of course. Maurice is very well explained. He's an asshole. That's about all there is to him. But in that context, I feel as though they definitely could have done a little bit more to make it clear what certain things are going on. They could have hidden what the Turngate virus was a lot better to make it a little bit more frightening. Like, even before the reveal at the end, they talked way too much about what it was, and that really diminished the fear I had of the virus and of Maurice, so, which I think is a shame. So, going from there, we could talk a little bit about the characters. There were only basically like 3 characters in that game. There's you, there's the Doctor, and there's Maurice, essentially. The Doctor, well, you kill her, she may or may not have been a hallucination. I don't really know. Probably was not a hallucination is my guess, but, you know, she just has a few audio log sort of moments where she talks at you while you're going from computer to computer. She never really gets that much development other than being alone and scared in the middle of a place infested with creepy monsters. And then you murder her. I mean, as far as characters go, she wasn't all that interesting to me. They definitely just made her sort of a device to move the plot along. And I think they were trying to build up an emotional attachment for when, you know, you did kill her, you'd feel bad about it or something. And I mean, yeah, in a certain sense I do, but like when I play video games, I've got a very firm understanding that these aren't real people. I don't have to feel bad about them if they get killed. So, I mean, yeah, you know, I definitely could have said that, yeah, maybe it would have been nicer if I hadn't murdered her, but at the same time, you know, they hadn't built her up as a character. She was rarely ever there. It didn't make a huge difference to me. And similar, the other one is Maurice. Maurice definitely felt like an interesting character. He had a lot of development. He flip-flopped on a lot of things. He essentially grew as a character, which is very strange for a virus. And, you know, it was ultimately his undoing, I suspect, to a very large degree. But, yeah, he was legitimately an interesting character. And I was kind of astonished by that. You know, it was always interesting to hear what he had to say. He was a complete jackass, but, I mean, what he had to say or what he was talking about at any given time was usually pretty interesting. And especially how he changed. And I think part of it was the voice acting, but how pathetic and lonely he sounded near the end of it really was an interesting twist to his character that I'm not sure was intentional, but I think probably was. I mean, the fact that he was this sort of lonely, pathetic thing that was looking for you at the end, and he sounded whiny and pathetic when he wanted to talk to you. That was, to me, was very interesting. Okay, I forget how to use items in this. There we go. So, yeah, the characters ranged from weak to really quite well developed, and I think that since Maurice was definitely the more critical of those characters, Clarence rather, since he was definitely the more relevant of them, they did a good job developing him. Now, I have a problem with the main character in these sort of games being relatively tabula rasa character, and the main character of Penumbra definitely felt that way. He had a little bit of personality in the way that he talked to people during those logs. He seemed like he had a very... I don't know how to put it. He had a very flowery way of writing and speaking. A very strange way of writing and speaking, rather. But, yeah, I don't think he ever really displayed much in the way of personality. He definitely felt like he was just a blank slate character with very little going on for him, which, you know, always bothers me when a character is like that. And, like, I think that they could have done more, certainly, to make it as though he were an interesting, well-developed character, which he is not. He's definitely not that. But... yeah, I'm gonna wait till these guys finish talking here. Okay, but yeah, like, essentially those were the only characters, and the main character just had no personality whatsoever. He was just a blank slate to project yourself onto and potentially feel the fear of. I never liked that kind of character. It's the reason I like Bioshock Infinite better than I like the original Bioshock. But, I mean, to each their own. A lot of people like having just a very blank character that they can pretend they are. It's like, yeah, I can totally relate to this guy that has no personality. I mean, I've got no personality. To all of you who actually like those style of games, I'm just kidding. You guys have plenty of personality. But yeah, the reason they do that is that if they make a definitive character that has definite traits and definite attitudes towards certain things, it's harder for people who don't share that mindset to, then follow that sort of character, to empathize with them necessarily, to believe that they are that character. And I think that to a lot of game developers, they want to instill that feeling in people. I'm just not interested in that kind of character. I want to hear a story about a character, which, is a very different sort of scenario. Oh, great, I'm getting to that point of insanity. Alright, there we go. Wait, the one in here blows out. Shit. So, yeah, I think that there's definitely good and bads about the way they've done the characters. As is usually the case. I mean, honestly, that is usually the case in games like this. But I definitely feel as though the main character is weak. The only real interesting character is Maurice. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about as far as a lot of the elements of it goes. So we're just going to wrap this up by talking about my final sort of feelings about this game. Penumbra, to me, feels like one of the custom stories made for Amnesia Dark Descent, okay? If you've ever played one of those, like, sort of rough amateur ones, that's kind of how it feels. And I don't know if that is something that I would say is a good thing. I definitely feel as though they didn't have as much of an idea about what they were supposed to do as they would later develop. And to a large extent, I think that is something that they developed and learned from, and that became sort of more or less not a problem by the time they made Amnesia Dark Descent. But when they're actually making Penumbra, there are a lot of elements that don't work all that well, and I think that ultimately detracts significantly from the experience. Now, if you're playing Penumbra just to sort of see where Frictional Games comes from, because obviously they made it before Amnesia, yeah, you can play it for that reason, and that's actually not that bad a reason to play something. It's just you want to sort of see how things went and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, it wasn't a very fun experience for me. I don't think that I can honestly recommend playing Penumbra to play it as a horror game, to have fun with it. And it's not just because it didn't age well necessarily. It was frustrating as a game. It was not very well thought out, I don't think. Or rather, the elements that were in it were thought out in isolation of the rest of the game, it felt like. And so it was not actually as scary as it could be. Now, if you haven't played Amnesia yet, you could opt to play Penumbra before you play Amnesia. It's not a terrible horror game, but the problem is you've got a lot of other options out in the market right now. There are a lot of excellently made custom stories. There's a lot of really well-developed mods for Amnesia. And there's, of course, Amnesia, there's Justine, and there's Machine for Pigs. All of those are actually really good games that I would highly recommend that you do play. And there's enough of those out there that you don't have to play Penumbra, I don't feel. Now, I mean, if you are an absolute horror game junkie, you've already played Penumbra, you've already played Amnesia, you've already played all these other ones. So, for those of you who are not necessarily that into horror all that often, you don't necessarily play that much horror, you don't necessarily want to play Penumbra because it's not that great an experience. I would recommend highly, rather than playing Penumbra, you play Amnesia because they've learned all their lessons from Penumbra by then. They understand what the game they want to make is. They started to understand how they want their game to work. They want what they want the players to feel and how they want to make their world. So it ultimately is just an inferior game that has a lot of ideas that later get transcribed into Amnesia and to their other games. If you're really into the setting of Penumbra, as opposed to the sort of dark castle experience or the dark mansion experience, you want to play in a sort of well-lit lab, then I guess you could play it for that, but if you were honestly in it for that purpose, I would recommend Silent Hill. It's another older game as well, but I feel it does that better. I feel like if you're going to play that style of game, it's better to play one that isn't made by people who are... I'm not sure actually if Konami made that game when they were amateurs, but it definitely didn't feel as though the first two Silent Hills were made by amateurs. And they're both excellent games, Silent Hill 1 and 2. Oh, right. Hi, buddy. Come back here. No. Aw. But anyway, yeah, like, I just feel as though if you like that sort of environment, that setting of like a creepy hospital sort of thing, Silent Hill, like, the entire game does not take place in that. A lot of portions of a lot of horror games take place in creepy, like, doesn't have to be hospital, but a creepy, like, psych ward or something like that. Anything similar to that environment is pretty common in horror games. So if you like that environment, I would recommend something like Silent Hill. Siren, a lot of it takes place in a hospital, if I recall correctly. Those sorts of things could be better options, in my opinion, if you want that kind of setting. So it just doesn't have a whole lot to offer that I think makes the frustration worth it. And ultimately, that's the game breaker here. That's the deal breaker for me, is that it is a frustrating game to play. It's not fun to play. So, yeah, that's ultimately my opinion of Penumbra. Obviously, if you've played a lot of horror games, you want more, you're craving more, and for some reason you haven't played it, then give it a try. I definitely would not dissuade you from doing that if you have yet to play it and you've played all the other horror games. But it definitely is not really up to par for Frictional Games. So anyway, I hope you found this video informative. And of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.